Do you remember the specific sound of tickets? That thin paper strip tearing free from the roll, one ragged perforated edge at a time, while the ride operator's fingers moved almost automatically, not even looking down, because he'd torn 10,000 of these before you ever showed up? Do you remember the smell that hung over the whole midway? A mix of scorched sugar from the cotton candy machine, hot grease from the fry stand, and something underneath it all that was just heat itself, asphalt and metal baking in the sun since noon. Do you remember standing at the base of a wooden roller coaster, feeling the whole structure shudder through the soles of your shoes as a train crested the first hill somewhere above you, the wood groaning like it was alive, like it might not hold, and loving that feeling of doubt? If any of that just pulled something loose in your memory, something you hadn't thought about in years, you're exactly who this channel is for. We spend our time here digging into the physical spaces that shaped ordinary American life and then quietly disappeared. Not the headline moments, not the wars or the elections, but the textures and sounds and small rituals of regular days that somehow vanished without anyone deciding to let them go. If that sounds like your kind of rabbit hole, stick around, hit subscribe, and let's get into it. Because today, we're going back to the 1950s Amusement Park. And I promise you, it was a fundamentally different animal from the theme parks your kids or grandkids go to now. To understand what made these parks feel the way they did, you have to understand where they came from. And that means understanding the trolley park. Long before Disneyland opened its gates in July of 1955, cities across the country were dotted with parks built by streetcar companies, private transit operators who owned the electric trolley lines running out to the edges of town. These companies faced a specific business problem. Their heaviest ridership happened on weekday mornings and evenings, when people commuted to work, but on weekends and in the evenings, the cars sat mostly empty, and the company was still paying for electricity and maintenance regardless of how many people rode. So streetcar companies started building parks at the end of their lines, out past the last street lamp, past the edge of the developed city, places with picnic groves and dance pavilions, and eventually carousels and mechanical rides, specifically to generate weekend and evening ridership on tracks that would otherwise sit idle. Coney Island's Luna Park, which opened in 1903, under the direction of Frederic Thompson and Elmer Dundy, became the template. Electric lights, exotic architecture, mechanical spectacle. And by the 1920s there were reportedly close to 2,000 of these trolley parks scattered across the country, according to amusement industry historians. Many of the parks that defined the 1950s experience, places like Kennywood outside Pittsburgh, which traces its roots back to 1898, or Cedar Point on Lake Erie, which had been operating since 1870, were direct descendants of this trolley park model, even after the streetcars themselves started disappearing. So by the time you're walking into one of these parks in, say, 1955 or 1956, you're walking into a space that was never designed by a single, unified corporate vision. It grew. It accreted, ride by ride, concession stand by concession stand, often over 50 or 60 years, added to by different owners with different ideas, and that's part of why it felt the way it did. The entrance itself was usually modest by design. A ticket booth, maybe an arch overhead with the park's name spelled out in incandescent bulbs, dark and unlit if you were arriving in daylight, and you paid your way in, either through a single gate admission, or, more commonly at these older parks, through a pay-as-you-go system, where you bought a strip of ride tickets and each ride cost a different number of tickets, depending on how elaborate or expensive it was to operate. The midway stretched out in front of you, usually a wide central walkway, lined on both sides with games of chance, the milk bottle toss, the ring toss, the shooting gallery with its metal ducks moving on a chain track behind the counter, each duck pinging when a pellet found it. The barkers worked these booths, standing, not sitting, calling out to passers-by in that specific rhythmic patter, half song and half sales pitch. And you could hear 3 or 4 of them overlapping at once as you walked the midway, competing for your attention and your remaining tickets. The rides themselves were, by later standards, mechanically simple, and that simplicity was part of the sensation. The classic wooden roller coaster, and Kennywood's Jack Rabbit built in 1920, or the Racer, added in 1927, are still standing examples of exactly this era of design. Ran on a structure of southern yellow pine, bolted and cross-braced by hand, with a track surface of flat steel strapping laid over the wood, rather than the tubular steel rails that would come to dominate later decades. Because the structure itself flexed under the weight and speed of the train, you felt every joint, every seam, every slight give in the wood as the cars passed over it, which is why these rides had a specific rattling, shuddering quality that steel coasters simply don't reproduce. The lap bar across your thighs was often the only restraint. No shoulder harness, no over-the-shoulder restraint system, just a single metal bar that a ride operator checked by hand, walking down the length of the train, and pressing down on each one before signaling the operator in the booth to release the brake. The carousel, meanwhile, occupied its own building or pavilion, usually round or many-sided, with a band organ, a genuine mechanical instrument, not a recording, playing through pressurized air and perforated paper rolls, the same technology used in player pianos, producing a slightly off, slightly wheezing version of a popular tune that somehow made it more charming rather than less. The horses themselves, if the carousel dated to the golden age of carousel carving between roughly 1880 and 1930, were often hand-carved by craftsmen from workshops like Philadelphia Toboggan Company or the Herschel Spillman Company. Each animal individually painted, no two of them quite identical, with real horsehair tails on the finer examples, and glass eyes that caught the light as the platform turned. Food came from stands, not restaurants, and the food itself told you something about the technology and economics of the era. Cotton candy machines, patented originally in 1897 by a dentist named William Morrison and a confectioner named John C. Wharton, and later refined and mass-marketed, spun sugar through centrifugal force into that impossible cloud of pink or blue thread, made fresh at the stand while you watched, the machine's motor whining underneath the hiss of melting sugar. Popcorn came from a machine with an actual visible kettle, the kernels popping audibly, the smell of hot oil and browned corn drifting further down the midway than almost any other single scent in the park. And saltwater taffy, a boardwalk staple whose popularization is often credited to Atlantic City candy maker Joseph Fralinger around the turn of the century, got pulled on mechanical taffy pulling machines that sat right in the shop window, hooks rotating the warm candy back and forth in long stretching loops that you could watch happen in real time, which was itself a form of entertainment before you'd even bought anything. But here's the thing people rarely talk about when they get nostalgic for these parks, and it's worth sitting with for a second. The design of a 1950s amusement park wasn't just charmingly ramshackle, it was largely unplanned in a specific structural sense. And that lack of planning is exactly what produced the social experience people remember so warmly. There was no single sightline engineered to control your movement through the space, no unified theme forcing every element into a coherent story. You bumped into things. You wandered. You ran into your neighbors from 3 streets over. Because the park drew from a genuinely local, working-class and middle-class regional population, rather than from tourists flying in from other states, and there was no reservation system. No fast pass. No app telling you where to be and when. Just proximity, chance, and the fact that on a hot Saturday in July, half your town had independently decided to be in the same place you were. That unplanned social density, the accidental collisions with people you knew, was a genuine structural feature of how these parks were built and run, not just a rosy trick of memory. These parks also occupied a specific economic tier that doesn't really exist anymore in quite the same form. A day at Kennywood, or a comparable regional park in the mid-1950s, was affordable, in a way that meant working-class families could actually go regularly, not as a once-a-decade special trip requiring months of saving, and that accessibility shaped who you'd see there and how casually the whole experience was treated. So what actually happened to these parks? Because most of them didn't survive, and the ones that did survive changed almost beyond recognition. Part of it was simply land economics. Many trolley parks sat on land at the edge of cities that, by the 1960s and 1970s, had become extremely valuable. As those cities sprawled outward through post-war suburban development, and a park owner sitting on 50 acres of increasingly prime real estate near a growing suburb faced constant, rational pressure to sell to developers, rather than keep reinvesting in aging wooden rides. Part of it was liability and insurance. As personal injury litigation expanded through the 1960s and 70s, and insurance costs for older, less regulated mechanical rides climbed accordingly, many smaller parks found the numbers simply stopped working, especially for parks that had never modernized their restraint systems or ride inspection protocols. Part of it was direct competition from an entirely new model. Disneyland's 1955 opening, and the theme park boom that followed through Six Flags, which opened its first park in Arlington, Texas, in 1961, introduced something the old trolley parks fundamentally weren't built to compete with: a single unified corporate vision, controlled sightlines, a coherent narrative theme tying every ride and building together, and, critically, enormous capital investment that let these new parks build steel coasters and elaborate dark rides that the older, family-owned regional parks often couldn't afford to match. And part of it, less dramatically but just as real, was the decline of the American downtown itself, and the shift toward car-based suburban leisure, which pulled foot traffic and disposable income away from the old trolley line locations, and toward newer developments built explicitly around highway access and parking capacity. Now, it would be easy, and it would also be dishonest, to frame all of this as pure loss. Modern theme parks ruining something sacred. That's not really fair. It's not really true. Modern parks are safer in ways that matter enormously. Ride engineering today involves redundant restraint systems, computer-monitored ride cycles, and inspection standards that simply didn't exist in 1955, and that difference has genuinely saved lives. Modern parks are also more accessible for people with disabilities, more thoughtfully designed for extreme heat and crowd flow, and often better maintained overall, because the corporate capital behind them allows for consistent reinvestment that a small family-owned trolley park frequently couldn't sustain decade after decade. What got lost wasn't safety or polish. What got lost was that specific, unplanned, unthemed, locally rooted texture, the sense that you were in a space that had simply grown over 50 years, rather than been designed all at once, populated by your actual neighbors rather than tourists, priced for a regular Tuesday rather than a once-a-year pilgrimage. So I want to ask you directly, because this is really why we do this. What's the specific ride, or the specific sound, or the specific stand you remember from a park like this, one that's probably gone now, or so changed you wouldn't recognize it? Not the park's name in general, the actual detail. The taffy machine in the window, the particular creak of a specific wooden coaster's first drop, the name of the guy who ran the ring toss every summer of your childhood. Tell me in the comments, because somewhere out there, someone else remembers the exact same thing, and they don't know it yet.